Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video, I'll be ranking every player that was voted out and returned to the game on Big Brother, which is obviously a show that does buybacks pretty often. I mean, half of the seasons of the show with the modern format do have buybacks in it. There was literally a stretch from BB's 15 to 21 that had at least one buyback on each of those seasons. And while it is a bit inconsistent outside that, again, we still have 14 players to be ranking here. Again, from 12 total seasons, but again, there also being a person that was voted out twice on one season. So again, there were a lot of opportunities for people to come back, but here I'll be ranking them based on how they played on their individual seasons, not again on my opinion of them as players in the grand scheme of things, though realistically I feel like there's only a couple minor changes to that, particularly from the returning player side of things. But either way, let's get started with the ranking. At number 14, the worst player to be voted out and came back to the game is Cody from BB19. And again, I think Cody plays an absolutely abysmal game. I mean, he is someone that, while he was in the initial power structure, which, I mean, to be fair, a lot of that could have been just due to the fact that he was the first HOH. But again, he was in this initial couples alliance that formed right away. He instantly blows it up in trying to target Paul, even though he didn't have the numbers to do so. And while again, you could argue, oh, he got screwed over by the pendant of protection, it's like Paul wasn't going home anyway. I mean, a lot of the basis around people being upset at him putting up Christmas was more so them being annoyed at him putting up Paul to begin with. And again, like, the issue was not the pendant of protection. The issue was just going for Paul at all during this week when he got no support from it. Him again not telling most of his alliance about it, him only implying it to Mark, and Mark even telling him to not do it, only for him to do it anyway. And again, that leads to him being backdoored in week 2 with almost the entire house helping Paul win HOH. So again, that was really bad. But then he comes back into the game only to be on the bottom once again and then end up voting incorrectly, where despite Jessica winning HOH, they end up failing to take out a number on the opposing side, and then really just on the bottom from that point forward, only surviving due to the halting hex and him winning the temptation challenge, and eventually he's taken out right at the start of the jury. I mean, again, like, Cody's game has nothing really positive to say about it outside of, okay, he's good at competitions, I guess. But even then, he didn't really come off as like a truly elite competitor. He's only won one HOH and a couple other random comps. Cody's a pretty bad player, played a pretty bad game. He's here at number 14. Now at 13, we're moving on to a player that, again, like, I think if we're assessing this as this person as a player in the grand scheme of things, this person would be higher. However, if we're basing it just on this one game, he is this low. You have Brendan from BB13. I think Brendan is a player that has always demonstrated a lot of potential, while he never really executed on that. And to be fair, I think a lot of that is due to the fact that he was always in the house with Rachel, who was his bigger priority. I still think there is some decent game sense with him, but again, this is a game that is just kind of bad. I mean, he comes into the game already with a pre-built alliance with the other vets, and while they do run the show for first few weeks, I mean, to be fair, a lot of that is due to the fact that Rachel herself is HOH for 2 of those weeks, while the other one, Jordan's HOH, and even then she does consider taking out Brendan during her HOH week. We then follow that up with their games being a lot more in flux at the end of Rachel's HOH week through this feud with Danny, where Danny wins the following HOH and takes Brendan out. Now again, is it unlucky that someone that would have taken Brendan out at that point won HOH? Yes. I mean, I do think at that point only a couple people would have actually gone for Brendan, but I do think it is Rachel and Brendan's poor work with Danielle that caused her to go after them, especially when she was actually pretty close to Rachel at the very beginning and really had been more focused on Jeff and Jordan than Brendan and Rachel until that final week. And then again, he does win the veto and uses it on Rachel, which again, how much do you really assess that as gameplay? Obviously, as gameplay, it's terrible. It sends him home. Though obviously it is him making a move outside the game of Rachel wanting to be there more and him giving her more of the opportunity. Also, he wanted to technically go home, which he didn't end up being able to do. But anyway, he has a buyback. He comes back and then immediately proceeds to get backdoored again. So again, like, there's not really much to praise on his second time around. And his first time around, again, like, I just feel like a lot of his game is based around the fact that he came into the game with vets on his side, and even then isn't able to secure them together and has one of his own vets take him out 2 times in a row. So again, while I do think Brendan's probably a better player than this on the ranking, I think his game on this season is pretty poor. So because of that, for me, he's here at number 13. And number 12, we're moving on to the most recent person to have gotten voted out and returned to the game. Here you have Cameron from BB25. And Cameron straight up, I think, is a pretty bad player. I mean, he is one that, while he does have good instincts at points, he also completely blew up his game in week 1 by ratting out his own alliance. He then proceeds to be a backup target for really the next few weeks after that, to where then he finally wins HOH, and despite him having all the clues to piece together that he's on the bottom, he simply just doesn't do anything about it, only to then be targeted the following week, only to survive due to a veto win and get blindsided by the vote, only to then win HOH again, to where he finally realizes that he needs to make a move. So again, week 6 is the thing I would give him some credit for. I mean, while again, I do think his initial noms of Izzy and Felicia are pretty bad, the fact that he eventually is able to set the wheels in motion on the flip that caused Izzy to go home is something to give him at least a little bit of credit for. It's really one of the only times in the entire game that he actually listens to other people, so that's a miracle. But again, he does end up convincing Jag to flip against Izzy. Again, there is some good work in that week, and while he does get backdoored the following week in a position where he probably shouldn't have been, he probably should have been able to rekindle his relationship with Jared, I do think his zombie week is pretty good. Again, I do think the way he is able to reconnect with Matt and Jag is pretty strong. I think he sets himself up to be safe for next few rounds, only for him to then win HOH and veto the next week and make himself an even bigger threat, and then proceed to get backdoored the following week. Again, it's a rocky game. I think the thing is, in comparison to Brendan from BB13 in particular, I do think he at least has that week 6. I think he does play well-ish. And obviously there's a lot more longevity there. It's just more like individual things I could point out to that I think Cameron did well. Even though I think Cameron is a worse player, I think his overall social game is terrible. And even then strategically he's a mixed bag. But still, I think in terms of, for this list in particular, just about their games, I feel like there's at least more positives I can bring out for Cameron from 25 than I can with Brendan from 13. So that's why he's here number 12. Now number 11, moving on to someone that actually made it pretty far, and I believe for a while held the record for the furthest someone went after coming back into the game. And as the first person to ever do it, I do have Amy from BB3. And just straight up, Amy is just not that good of a player. I mean, while she is a fun personality for sure, she again is booted in week 3, mostly just because she didn't get along with a lot of people. She was just kind of an expendable person in the house. She was targeted alongside Marcellus, and just more people wanted to keep Marcellus around. Really not many people wanted to even have Amy around by that point. Then she gets booted and gets back into the game, which, I mean, to be fair, she gets voted back into the game, so at least that is a minor positive, but then proceeds to just be the perpetual pawn for the rest of the game. Again, she does take out Kiara with an HOH win. That's something. Outside of that, she's literally just on the block the rest of the time. At one point, even being willing to give up her game for Roddy, only for her to not go through with it and then immediately regret it, but really has no control over how any of the game plays out from that point forward. And at the final 4 where she gets voted out, it's pretty bad that she's getting voted out. She's getting voted out despite the fact that she's this massive GOAT in the game that anyone would have beaten, yet instead Jason and Danielle decide to take Lisa and risk losing to her, which they obviously eventually do, which is really a game-ending move for them. And again, the fact that she wasn't able to convince him of that, I think is pretty indicative of her poor gameplay as well. And I just think Amy is someone that doesn't really have anything to prop her up in the game outside of longevity, where outside that, again, she really had no clue what was going on really at any point in the game. She was kind of just dragged along just because there were bigger threats in the game, and even then was even taken to the very end. And again, was already a 3rd boot where she was just such an expendable person in the house. So again, I just don't feel like there's much to really praise from Amy. So because of that, for me, she's here at 11. At number 10, we're going to a player that I feel like has one really big move that I'll give him a lot of credit for. Outside that, not a great season, but here we do have Kaser from BB6. And again, for me, Kaser is someone that pulled off a very impressive move. Him pulling the numbers together to take out the Sovereign 6 is a pretty, again, strong move there. It is one where he pulls in the outsiders and takes out the leader of the opposing side. Now, I will say, I do think the way he executes the move is one that even further stokes this divide in the house, to where it builds the side that is so loyal to Cappy, while obviously his side is very anti-Cappy. Though at the same time, it's like, I don't know how else he would have gone through that move, and really he was in a bad position coming into that HOH. So I do think that move was the correct move to make, though he then proceeds to obviously be a massive target in the game. Though even then, James is someone that definitely could have been targeted over him coming into his initial boot week. So obviously James ends up being saved with the veto, and through that, Kaser's kind of screwed in that situation. And obviously he comes back and gets voted out right away again, despite coming in second in the pressure cooker. Again, that's all really bad. But again, I think early on, at least, again, there is that really big move, probably the best move any of the players up to this point have made in their games. But while the rest of it is, again, not particularly great, I do think his move in week 3 is still very impressive, which is the reason why he's here at number 10. Now, number 9, we're moving on to a player that I did question where to put this player, just because I think this player as a whole is someone that is mostly bad, but then when I think through their game, while the way they go out the first time is really bad, I do feel like there's other things to prop them up for. And at number 9, I do have Scotty from BB20. And Scotty's a player that, again, like gets taken out from his own ally. I mean, he's in a position where at the final 9, it is a 6-3 divide. And despite that, one of his own allies takes him out of the game. Again, that is really bad. You also have him coming back and getting taken out immediately afterwards, which, to be fair, I don't know how much of a shot he really had there, but still, both the situations, really, really bad. Also, his position in the game was one that was very rocky. I mean, while he was more loyal to the Falte side of things, he never fully trusted him, which kind of leads to him eventually being taken out. And obviously, was never really working with the level 6 side either, outside of just his allegiance with Tyler, which in itself was always fake from Tyler's point of view. And that's kind of bad, but I do think early on, I do think he plays okay. I mean, again, he was in the middle of the house early on and was kind of effectively playing both sides, at least well enough to where he was relatively safe in the game. But then when he wins week 3 HOH, he does make a pretty big move there, targeting Winston and Brett. A move that obviously exposes what side he's on, but still a move that I think was necessary for his game at that point, as the level 6 side of things had obviously become too strong by that point, losing 2 people with the Falte side of things, losing 2 people back to back. I think the fact that he didn't relent and still continue to target level 6, I think it at least shows some level of game acumen. So yeah, I think it's that and his ability to play the middle for at least a little part of the game that leaves him this high, even though the rest of his game is pretty bad. But either way, he's here at number 9. Now, number 8, we're moving on to a player that, to me, is essentially just a slightly better version of Scotty, which is the game that they played. I think this person at least had a chance of making it to the end of the game at a point, but still a mostly subpar game as a whole. But this game comes from a person that is a much better player than they are represented on this list, and that is Nicole Franzel from BB16. And I mean, straight up, Nicole's game in BB16 is just kind of lackluster. She's someone that is not being targeted early on. At least there's that, but she's also not really part of the core power structure. I mean, obviously her, Hayden, and Christine had a very early alliance, though Christine always seemed to be more loyal to the detonators side of things. And through that, again, Nicole was just kind of just waiting for her spot in the pecking order. Though again, the reason why Nicole is above Scotty for me is because there was at least a glimmer of hope at a point. There was a point in the game, particularly her HOH reign, the one where Jocasta eventually goes home, where her and Hayden actually do some pretty decent work in getting Derek and Cody to side with them at a point. Again, the trust between Derek and Cody and Frankie and Christine had completely fractured to where they did take opportunity of that, to where it did seem like Derek and Cody were actually loyal to their 4 for a little bit, though obviously by the end of the week it completely crumbles. They flip the vote on them, and from that point on, Nicole's on the bottom, taken out on her own HOH week somehow. Again, that's how Battle of the Block works out. Taken out also by one of her closest allies from earlier in the game, and Christine, only to then come back to the game, and while she does survive a round past Donnie, she then is taken out after that. Again, not much to truly praise here in my mind. It's a game where she's not really in a power position for most of the game, and while again, I think her HOH reign was actually decent until the last day or so, it still doesn't hold. So for me, still kind of a lackluster game as a whole. And I guess you can argue the fact that her first boot is her getting screwed over by Battle of the Block, but at the same time, I mean, she was going to be booted soon anyway. Again, I still think a pretty lackluster game, and that's why she's here at number 8. Now, number 7, we're moving on to probably one of my bigger blind spots on this list, where this version comes from a season that, while I do love the season more than most people, I do feel like from a gameplay front, it definitely isn't my expertise. But at number 7, I'm going with Crazy James from BB9. And James here is a player that really, I feel like the first half of his game is not bad. So where, again, initially he had this really core group of allies, him and Chelsea alongside Joshua and Sharon, and they were winning competitions and had decent amount of control coming into the individual portion of the game. Although once that occurs, he's obviously one of the bigger targets on his side of the house, though it did seem like his side was winning the battle for Ryan's allegiance, who was very much in the middle at that point, where there was a plan to backdoor Maddie for most of that week until it flips at the very last second due to Sheila being Sheila, where where that causes James to get backdoored, which, again, I don't know how much to truly fault James. Obviously, there is fault to be had, but I don't think it's a bad way for him to go out. That was like the only part of his game where, again, it seemed like he was in a pretty good position up to that point in the game. Though once he returns to the game, he's obviously more on the bottom. Though, to be fair, a lot of that is due to comp wins. His side just simply doesn't win the comps despite being equally matched coming into the final 8 round. Where coming into the final 8, it is 4v4. Again, he makes this move against Maddie, which, again, you can probably fault in the sense that he is fully solidifying the lines between sides, but I still think it's a move that does make sense for James, particularly at that point where Maddie was very anti-James. So, again, he comes to the final 8 4v4, and again, if his side had just won any HOH, and while he was, again, the target for the opposing side, if his own side had just won HOH at any point, he definitely would have been in a much better position in the game. But Team Christ just continued to win HOH after HOH after HOH, and he continued to win veto after veto after veto. Though even then, at the final 6, he's still kind of able to convince Adam to not put him on the block initially, which, again, is probably more indicative of Adam's poor play, but obviously he still gets taken out there. Again, like, it's a game that I just think is kind of rocky, particularly the back portion of his game, where outside of taking out Maddie, the rest of it is just him winning competitions, the skate on by, while early on, even then, he was kind of messy. I remember he got caught leaking information at a point, and that led to this big house blow up. So again, like, it's a very rocky game, but for me, I do end up landing him here at number 7. At number 6, we're moving on to a player that this person would be higher if they didn't get booted so early on in the game, and then proceeds to get voted out again later in the game. And that person is Victor from BB18. And Victor's a player that I think gets a bit slept on in Big Brother history. Not saying he's like an all-time great player by any means. Though I think when people talk about Victor, they talk about just the fact that he came back twice and that he was good at comps, and that's really the entirety of his game. But again, I do think it is more acumen to get from Victor's game. Now again, early on, his first stint in the game is bad. Like, I think 100%, like him working with Jose, which, to be fair, again, had about half the house working together there. Again, at least that's something to give him credit for, is that he was in a pretty major alliance. So obviously Jose gets taken out, and then he proceeds to be backdoored the following week. Though again, once he comes back into the game, I think he actually plays decently there. Yes, he is letting Paul do a lot more of the strategic work for him, but also it benefits Victor to be doing that as well. And I think after where he comes back, he steps up his social game to where he is mostly liked, he is mostly respected, to where he becomes probably the biggest jury threat of the entire season. Again, he finds himself within Paulie's power structure and then proceeds to flip the vote on Paulie when him and Paul realize that they're towards the bottom of it. He then gets evicted the second time, though again, for me, this was such a fluky elimination where I don't really fault Victor too much for it, to be honest. I mean, it was a situation where Victor wasn't even a target, and I feel like Victor gets screwed over in like multiple ways this week, where again, first up, it was, again, Nicole's impressive play for sure in her getting Natalie and Michelle to mistrust Paul. That again made them want to target Paul, but they were like, okay, if we're going to put up Paul, we have to put up Victor next to him in case of the veto. So again, that is why Victor's on the block initially. Paul wins the veto, takes himself off. Corey is then on the block, and now Natalie and Michelle regret their decision. They now want to keep Victor in the game, but James obviously doesn't go through with it. However, I think something not commonly talked about here is that Victor very much gets screwed over by the double HOH twist, where this was a week where, again, Natalie was the actual HOH. However, America's Care Package made it so there was a second HOH. That HOH ended up being Michelle. That meaning that Michelle couldn't vote in this situation, despite the fact that both Natalie and Michelle had the same agenda. So because of that, this actually ends up being a situation where had there not been a co-HOH, Michelle would have voted to save Victor, and through that, Natalie is the tiebreaker and probably saves Victor as well. I do think his second boot round on this season is very wonky. It's like, I don't really fault him too much for it. And really, I think it's pretty impressive the way that Paul and Victor played that round, where they were able to convince Natalie and Michelle by the end of that week that they were not aligned anymore. And now coming back the second time, obviously he does kind of just fall into the typical traps of, yeah, he's able to align himself with Nicole and Corey, and they run a lot of the game after that. But again, he ends up falling for a trap of winning final 6 HOH and being the one to take the shot at James and Natalie, which leads to Nicole and Corey now being in the position to take the shot at them at 5, where Victor does eventually go home. So again, not particularly great third stint either, even though, again, I think there is things to credit him for, particularly in building this bond with Nicole and Corey that, again, while it didn't really pay dividends, again, I do think it does demonstrate, again, some decent social work from him, with them trusting him more more than they trusted Paul. So again, like I think there is some good stuff with Victor on this season. Or while he is the person that gets remembered for being voted out 3 times in one season, I do think there is some decent play around that. So because that for me, he is here number 6. And number 5, we're moving on to a player that, again, like straight up, this person would be lower than Victor had it not been for the fact that Victor was booted second on his season. Because for me, I feel like there's more impressive things to call out with Victor's game. However, this person did make it very far with a lot of win equity as well. And that person is Johnny Mac from BB17. And Johnny Mac is a player that I just find it very tough to assess in the fact that there are very few points in the game where he has any real control over how the game is being played out. He's someone that is kind of just on the bottom early on, not really that attached to either alliance, and is continuously just used as a pawn over and over again while he's able to survive that. And again, it is good enough to where people do actively want to keep him around. And I think his overall positioning at that point in the game is not particularly great. And he just continuously loses the people that he's close to in the mid game, losing Shelly and Clay, who he was close to, losing Becky. So by the time of the final 8, he's kind of in this position where he's just kind of out of numbers at that point and gets taken out kind of unceremoniously, only from the return to the game, to where at that point I do think there is some decent play from him. I do think he is able to build this relationship with Vanessa to where they end up having a working relationship moving forward. He still has a relationship with Steve that he had throughout the entire season. So again, they are pretty big swing votes at the Meg vote, though again, they don't really swing there, which I'm too fair they shouldn't have, but yeah, it does show that again, there was at least a point there where he had some control in the game, along with the fact that he gets his way at the final 6 round, and then final 5 round, he's another swing vote where, while I think he probably makes the right decision at the time of taking out Austin over Steve, it actually doesn't work to his benefit, as actually indirectly leads to the reason why he's taken out at 4, as had he taken out Steve at 5, it would have forced Vanessa to take him the 3 over Austin and Liz. But either way, again, like a Johnny Mac's game is just a consistently fine game against one with very little power until the very end of the game, but it's also again one where he had some win equity. I do think if he had gotten to the end on that season, I do think he beats probably both Liz and Steve. And again, against Vanessa, I think the votes are a little bit split. I mean, probably Vanessa wins though, but still, I do think he had a decent chunk of win equity on the season. But again, I just think there's like less impressive things to really call him out for, where it's just a consistently fine season for him. And that's why he's here number 5. Now number 4, we're moving on to a player that the decision between 3 and 4 was pretty tough for me, where I think one is a less flawed game, but the other one's a lot more active of a game and one that was better positioned. I'm still going to go with the latter because of that one having a lot more flaws, and that person is Judd from BB15. And again, Judd's game is a really interesting one, considering he's another one that I think his eventual boot is kind of a fluky one. Again, he gets sniped out the double eviction with no real chance to save himself, despite the fact that most people really felt bad about making the move. And to be fair, it felt like a move that was made because it was a double eviction. I think it's one that had he had more time to try to save himself, I do think there's a world where he could have. A lot of that comes from the basis of, again, I do think the first half of his game is pretty solid. I do think his game before his first boot is mostly good. Again, he has a good chunk of one-on-one bonds. He has his alliance with Andy, Amanda, and McCrae. He is a pretty important number through those first few weeks in the game, though he does start to lose trust within his own alliance, to where that is how the backdoor plan starts to come together the day before the eviction, where he gets sniped out of the game there, though obviously he comes back, and even when he comes back, he becomes part of the Exterminators, this alliance that runs the end game. And to be fair, he's on the bottom of that alliance, which is definitely the thing to knock him for. But again, it's still an alliance that pulled off the Amanda blindside, that pulled off the Alyssa move at the double. Again, it is some impressive play there. And now, again, I do think he gets taken out in a bit of a whimper when, again, he's just kind of on the bottom of his alliance and he's the one to go there, which is kind of underwhelming. But I do think there are a lot of pros to be said about Judd. Again, I think his early positioning was strong. He made moves in the end game and was part of one of the most important alliances of the season. Again, I do think there are these pros, but at the same time, again, he does still get taken out legitimately during the double. He does also still find himself at the bottom of his alliance and isn't able to crawl his way out of that. So again, those are definitely flaws. But yeah, I think as a whole, Judd's game is still pretty solid here for someone that got voted out and came back into the game, to where he's here at number 4. Now, number 3, we have a player that I think as a whole is probably closer to a Johnny Mac than they are to a Judd. However, I do think there are a lot of unlucky circumstances that happened to this person, so I boosted them up. And at number 3, I do have Sharon from BB9. And I mean, Sharon just has a lot of unlucky circumstances surrounding her. I mean, first, her initial eviction being one that was just really unfair. I mean, obviously she was attached to Jacob, who was this big social pariah after making an idiotic move after a power couple who were literally the sole vote to evict. For a while, they were safe for most of the first few days. They then get taken out simply because of what Jacob did. To where, again, I don't know how much Sharon could have really repaired that, and she was just taken out due to default, due to the twist. Now, she obviously gets the return to the game. Mind you, this is one of the few people that doesn't get the return due to some other sort of game mechanic. It's simply Neil leaves, and they were like, well, we need one other person, and Sharon's still in sequester, so we're going to put Sharon back on. But again, it's a situation where, like, I don't even really fault her that much for being the first boot to begin with. And again, she does do good work after that. She obviously has her relationship with Joshua. She has her relationship with James and Chelsea. They, again, almost pull off a pretty big move once the individual portion of the game starts of pulling over Ryan and blindsiding Maddie, only for that to not go through by the end. But then again, as I mentioned with James earlier, from that point on, her side's just not in the numbers. And while they do actually take out Maddie with James's HOH, they then proceed to lose every single HOH following that. And she just loses her allies one after another, despite, again, coming into the final 8 round tied in numbers. But once she gets to the final 5, again, I do think she plays well enough to go a bit under the radar while also building a relationship with Ryan to where they make a final 2. To where obviously Natalie goes out first at final 5. Only for us to then get to the final 4 round where, again, we get another very unlucky circumstance of a really idiotically written question that screws over Sharon. She could have won that HOH, and then after that, she would be one comp away from essentially winning the game, where if she had gotten to the very end, she more than likely wins, if not has 3 guaranteed jury votes, and just needs 1 more. Again, it would have been a very good spot for her. Though, realistically, again, was she winning final HOH? That's even up for debate, especially considering both comps were relatively physical. But still, I mean, like, definitely Sharon gets screwed over at multiple instances in her game. Now, again, I do think, like Johnny Mac, she's not really a big driver in the game while she is, like, campaigning for her way at points. Particularly, I think the Maddie vote was a big one that she was involved in. She wasn't as integral to how the game played out as some of the other people on this list. But again, I still think that her ability to be the last standing of her alliance and still having a lot of win equity, while again getting screwed over, while also her first boot not really being something I hold really that much against her, it's enough for her to be here number 3. Now, number 2, we're going on to a person that I wanted to put lower, but this person is the only winner on the list. So here we're gonna have Jag from BB25. And again, I've ranted about Jag's game in the past. I do think he makes the wrong decision at most opportunities, and even when he doesn't, it's decisions that most people are leading him on to. His early game is really bad, to where while he is in a big alliance at the very beginning, it falls apart and he's not able to really recover from that. So despite the fact that he thinks he does, he obviously ends up being in a fake alliance and proceeds to be taken out in week 4. Mind you, week 4 is one where, again, flip-flop back and forth. There was actually a point where he was going to be saved, though Jared ends up fighting back against taking out Blue, and he ends up going home there. So again, even then, it was a bit of a wonky vote, but he obviously gets saved by Matt, which straight up, again, I think is as luck dependent as you could possibly have it. Again, considering Matt got the power through one winning a competition, which it had to be a competition that Matt would be good at. Plus, also, it was a situation where America voted in the players that got to play in the competition, meaning that Matt also had to be one of the more popular players in the outside world, where again, there's very little control over that, along with the fact that, again, it had to be on this one specific week that the power could be used. So again, I think Jag gets very lucky on how this plays out, and then proceeds to, again, almost get taken out the following week, where he gets volunteer for the block and just lets it happen, and then proceeds to, in week 6, literally did the exact same thing he did in his boot week of not revealing the information to Cameron that could have saved him. It's terrible gameplay, but after the Izzy flip, which again, he had to be convinced to do the Izzy flip, his game does turn around a bit. I do feel like from that point on, again, he's obviously winning a lot of competitions, which are obviously a massive benefit to him, especially because he was a major target in the game. If he had not won those competitions, he definitely would have been targeted at least, particularly in the post-jury phase of the game. But again, he does technically get his way throughout a lot of that portion of the game. Mind you, his way is also what Matt had to convince him to do at points, but either way, getting rid of Cameron in particular is an example of that. He obviously gets rid of Mimi, though again, that was a situation where it was more of Corey and America pushing for it. He obviously stops the Corey back door, But even then, he wouldn't have been able to do that if it wasn't for Matt. Again, he targets Blue instead of Core in America. I think that's bad. Also, targeting Blue over America in itself is also bad, considering America was more actively coming for him. But again, final 5, I think he makes the right move, taking Suri out, but then proceeds to just take Matt to the end anyway, to where he just lucks out in a win, despite thinking that he would lose coming into it. So again, it's a bad game. The thing is, though, he still won the game, and in comparison to Sharon, or I did debate this, I do feel like at least Jag was more active in the game than Sharon. He actively got things done. And again, you can qualm with whether or not those things were the right things for him to do, or if they were really even his idea, but I feel like there's at least like more individual moves I can point out with Jag than Sharon, even though I think his level of gameplay throughout a lot of the season is probably lower than Sharon. But again, the fact that he wins, again, it's enough to barely squeeze him above her at number 2 here. Now, number 1, the best player to be voted out and came back to the game, for me, is a player that, again, I think this person played as well as they could have, considering their circumstances, and that person is Cliff from BB21. And again, obviously there's a lot of criticism over Cliff and how he just essentially let Jackson win the game. But again, considering his situation in the game, I do think he plays pretty optimally for a lot of it. I mean, early on, obviously he's an outsider simply because he's the old guy and not looped into the cool kids club, to where he is taken out in week 3. And again, that is something that's pretty bad, but it's also something that, again, I don't fault him too much for. Where one, it was mostly a move against Nick than it was against Cliff, where Cliff was the pawn for most of that week. Where again, the people that voted him out didn't even really want him gone and didn't even really want Nicole to stay. They just more so wanted to spite Nick, which obviously, yeah, you still fault him for getting voted out there, but I think in comparison to most other people's vote offs, it's not as egregious. Where outside of Sharon and probably Victor's second boot, this is probably the least bad of the vote offs here. And again, once he returns, I think he plays pretty well. He obviously wins HOH and targets Jack and Jackson, which was the optimal move at that point, though once threatened with Christie's power, he then relents and goes for Bella instead, and actually ends up building a relationship with the 6-shooter side of things, where again, he's not targeted following this, but it's still part of the big flip that happens when Jessica wins HOH, where they take out Jack. And at that point, Cliff plays pretty well in building a Final 4 deal with Jackson, Holly, and Nicole, building a stronger relationship with Jackson and Holly than Nicole does. And when Jackson and Holly really go on this massive comp run, again, he's kept safe throughout all of that. Now, I think where things start to crumble a little bit are the final 6 round. Obviously, final 6 is where Nicole wins HOH, and they had the opportunity to take out Jackson, though they don't go through with it. And to be fair, I don't think it is actually the optimal move for Cliff at that point to do so, though considering it is the last opportunity to do so, it's definitely something to call out. And we have the final 5 round, where obviously he takes out Tommy over Holly. Again, a move that I supported at the time. I think in retrospect, it's definitely a lot more up in the air for me, to where, again, there's massive pros and cons for it. For Cliff in particular, it's the path of least resistance, where Cliff was going to be taking the final 3 by Jackson and Holly either way. Well, again, I think it was more important for Nicole's game, but really, I do feel like, even though, again, I could still argue it is the right move for him to do it, I think the wrong move that he ends up making through this week is essentially making a deal for everyone to throw HOH to Nicole, which essentially just ruins his position that he set up to begin with. And to be fair, a lot of that isn't really gameplay based. That is more so based around him just feeling bad for leading Nicole to this end game that she's not that well positioned in. But again, it is definitely a flaw there. And obviously, Cliff does end up getting taken out there when Jackson wins the veto. But again, I do think Cliff played mostly optimally throughout a lot of that end game. Based on the situations he was handling at the time, I do think he makes the right call almost every time. Like, I think the big issue for Cliff is the fact that he just can't win competitions. And when he's facing off against Jackson and Holly and even Tommy, there's not much he can really do in that instance, especially when some of the lesser physical threats or kind of taken out outside of his control. And to support all this too is the fact that, again, I do think Cliff wins handily if he gets to the end. The jury seemed to be very pro Cliff at the time, to where, again, I think if he gets to the end against Nicole, handily wins. Holly handily wins. Now against Jackson, I do think it is a closer vote, and I do think it could go either way, but again, the jury was hyping up Cliff at that point, to where I would not be shocked if he just outright wins that. I do think at the end of the day, again, I don't really fault him that much for getting voted out. I think it is a very weird circumstance. And then mixing that in with the fact that, again, I think he plays a mostly optimal game afterwards, probably is one of the better strategic thinkers the show has had in terms of recognizing the layout of the game. So again, for me, I do have Cliff here at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my ranking. of every player that was voted out of the game and came back to it from Big Brother. Now, as coming up, just expect the typical style of videos that you can expect from this channel. I will be having a good chunk of big rankings coming this year, so stay tuned for those. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.